My name is Richard Ayres and I'm a social care advisor at Care England, and I want to welcome you to our joint Mills and Reeve Care England webinar titled Service Level Agreements in Supported Living Settings, What Providers Need to Know. So today we're really pleased to be joined by Daniel Braithwaite, Dan I'm allowed to call him, who's a Principal Associate with Mills and Reeve, and Mark Brodie, a Commercial Director at Eden Futures. So Dan and Mark are going to explain why care providers need to get their service level agreements, SLAs as some of you know them as, right, and they will take us through the often overlooked aspects of SLAs. They're going to take us through a slightly more detailed dive on and give an overview of the current supported living market, including the key trends, risks and challenges that we face, an outline of what goes wrong with SLAs and how to avoid the common pitfalls, and some best practice for drafting and negotiating SLAs that protect all parties. We'll then follow up with a Q&A session and give you a chance to pop questions both in the chat or to Dan and Mark directly. So when Dan and Mark are talking, you are free to use the chat facility to raise any questions during the presentation, or you're also free to email me directly and send the questions to me anonymously, and I'll ask those on your behalf, and I will drop my email address into the chat once we get started. I will ask you to keep yourselves on mute during the presentation if possible. Dan and Mark will take us through their presentation, which will take about 30 to 40 minutes, after which I will facilitate the Q&A session when you can raise your hand, or I'll ask any of the questions that have come up via email or in the chat. We are recording the session, and our intention is, as always, to note any questions and to send an FAQ if we don't get to answer them all after the event, plus a copy of the recording and the slides that you will see today, usually within 24 to 48 hours, but certainly by the end of the week, depending on what comes up during the call. So without further ado, please let me hand over to Dan and Mark to introduce themselves and start off today. So Dan, I will start with yourself.
Great, thank you, Richard. So as Richard said, my name's Dan Braithwaite. I am a Principal Associate at Mills and Reeve. If you haven't heard of us, we're a law firm with a particular specialism in health and social care matters. For myself, before being a private practice lawyer, I was an in-house lawyer for Craig Moore and then the Priory Group. So part of my role there was looking after the landlord function of our supported living business and providing training to the group's supported living services. So that's me. Mark, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and kick off.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you as well, Richard. So my name is Mark Brodie. I'm Commercial Director at Eden Futures, currently a social care provider. Held previous posts with other organisations, worked in operations as support worker right through to managing director, and also have worked in quality and now business development.
Back to you, Dan.
Okay. Yeah, to me. So I'm going to get us kicked off a little bit. I thought what might be useful is just to have a little bit of a demonstration of how far we've come in terms of supported living and the massive progress that's been made. So as we know, over the last sort of 50 years, there's been massive amounts of progress. And it really is a good reminder. It was a good reminder to myself in terms of how far things have come. Long-stay institutions were accepted as the norm. Then thinking started to move along into more community-based residential settings for care and support, majoritively shared environments registered with CQC in their own right. And that was a step towards better community integration. As we got towards the 90s, mid-90s, a monumental positive shift started to happen as we started to work towards the supported living that we all know today. The ideas and the concepts started to take shape, and that started to form and become part of the norm as we progressed. And it continues to progress, and it shows no signs of slowing at all, which is fantastic for the people supported. Next, please. So where are supported living environments now? There are many forms of supported living, and we'll break that down a little bit more in a moment. But for the purposes of this, we're focusing on new environments built to specific specifications that are expected in the modern environment for the person supported. The things that have changed The market is moving forward with less shared accommodation and more purpose-built environments, of which you can see. There's some of the environments that we at Eden have developed over the past few years. The supported living market itself in the UK has increased by 6% over the last 5 years and is predicted to increase by the same percentage in the next 3. So that increase is certainly speeding up. And I think that the COVID pandemic played a little bit of a part and threw a little bit of an anomaly in there as to why that growth over the last five years was 6%. It is estimated there'll be a need for a further 37,500 units of supported accommodation across the UK by 2037. So as well as the market demand increase, the environments themselves are changing as well. Environments continue to progress with the introduction of more robust materials, things like anti-ligature fittings. The buildings are now able to meet people's sensory needs, as well as technology making its presence felt in everybody's everyday lives. And the people we support are no exception. The environments are becoming smarter, more inclusive, while maintaining the high standards of a home-first approach, which I think we'll all agree is the most important thing. Next, please. So, some of the things that are changing in the development market, some of the trends around the development market, a lack of REIT funding. So a REIT fund being a real estate investment trust fund is that is funding and producing real estate across various sectors. Within this sector, primarily coming from Civitas and Triple Point. So at the moment, there is no REIT funding available. So one of the changes that's created within the development market is more self-funding developers are entering the space. This is positive. It's bringing new ideas, more long-term view, but also creating unknowns for providers as those relationships are built. It's particularly tricky as it's introducing a lot more of the unknowns to providers who are trying to develop these services whilst those relationships can be built. Smaller sites are being developed to stay away from the campus feel. That's particularly prevalent when a social care organisation was denied registration by CQC for their site because it was deemed to be a campus too large on one site. So that key factor is smaller sites are now being developed to stay in line with CQC's expectations. Longer term commitment needed by all parties so that return on investment can be realised, particularly for the developer. Not back to the arduous days of 25-year SLAs in the past, but there is a trend of 10 to 15-year SLAs now becoming more commonplace. This produces risk to providers in terms of the risks those SLAs contain will carry on into the business long term and potentially put in jeopardy the sustainability of services. The need for higher spec environments is rapidly increasing, as are the costs that go with them. Rightfully, the level of environment in supported living is increasing all the time. The high level of individual need is now being able to be met regularly, but that requires more robust environments. That requires a lot more thought through environments. And those higher specs are costing developers and in turn feeding through into the SLA, in turn costing housing providers and providers as well. Standards are being raised around supported living with things, groups like the Supported Living Improvement Coalition, bringing a positive perspective, views of multiple parties and directly representing people supported at the table as well. It's an excellent initiative. Really, things like this are really important to the sector, and the insight from it, representing that multitude of collective view right across the board, is helping with solid thinking for the sector, but also helping to shape the future around supported living as well. The rising cost of developments have increased in cost by 26% since 2020. As we all know, costs are rising across the board in all forms of life, but when it comes to developments and those rising costs, that is then incurring risks for all parties, which inevitably work their way through into an SLA and come to the door of providers. Really positive, more involvement from the people supported around their own home design at the early planning stages. We're seeing more and more of that, more and more co-production of environments, which is really important. Environments are being produced as part of wider residential projects. This provides some economy of scale for developers as well, if it's done as part of a larger residential project. But also bringing people supported closer to their community, multiple community needs being able to be met on site. The cost of general maintenance of these properties has raised between 30 and 50% since 2020, which again works its way into the SLA and works its way back down to providers. There is a shift away from remodeled or refurbished properties that might not be in the right locations by today's standards. Sites should meet multiple community needs, be on good bus routes, have direct access to the heart of local communities, and allow people supported to have that local community presence. That's where the demand sits from local authorities, and that is how the developments are being structured in the current market. I'm going to hand over to Dan. He's going to talk a little bit about the different models and how they can be set up with SLAs.
Thanks, Mark. So we thought it'd be useful at this point to we're conscious to be different levels of knowledge within the group here today. And some of you might be thinking, hang on, what does supported living today really look like? And what are these SLAs? So I suppose there are lots of different models of supported living being operated by different providers through the country. Here are three common models that we've sort of we see the most, and you'll see as I get into this where the service level agreement bit comes in that we've talked about, and we're going to talk about more. So that first model is where a care provider owns the property. They might have converted another service, they might have bought it or let it for a specific person's needs, or they've decided to develop a supported living scheme themselves. Care provider then directly lets the rooms, the units, directly to the people they support, and they also provide the care and support to them. Now, the positive here is for the care provider is that they've got control over arrangements. It is simple around who's maintaining the property. It's simple about responsibilities around property related support, and there is no complexity. There's no third party to have to deal with here. The negatives are that that care provider in its capacity as landlord cannot access enhanced levels of housing benefit. So the individual, although they'll have been granted a tenancy, they won't be able to access a higher level of housing benefit, which a housing association, in old speak, registered social landlord nowadays would be able to access. And second negative, and quite a big one, is that strictly speaking, this is not regulatory. This is not a regulatory compliant model. I say strictly speaking because it is quite common. You do see arrangements like this, and there is very little enforcement action happened in the last 12 years. To be honest, since this has been an issue. There is some very clear CQC guidance on this, though, about supported living settings being a de facto care home. And if you think that through, the risk is that you are registered maybe only for the personal care regulated activity when you should be registered for the providing accommodation regulated activity vis-a-vis with potentially in criminal offence territory. So we're talking about something quite serious. But I'd be lying if I said it wasn't common in the marketplace. There are lots of people out there doing that, rightly or wrongly. The second model there is where a care provider maybe is cognizant of that regulatory requirement, and they've granted a lease to a registered social landlord. housing association in old speak. That RSL manages the property and lets the rooms and units to an individual, to the individual supported, and then the care provider provides the care and support commissioned by the local authority in the usual way. Positives here are that that's relatively simple, as the care provider can decide how that structure is to work. All the control around who does property maintenance can be determined by the care provider. If they want to be responsible for their property, they can define the terms of the lease accordingly. If they don't want to be on the hook for voids, they could have a situation where the rent is payable, where the property is let and where it's not. They're relatively simple arrangements. The negative here, in my experience, is maybe that the RSL is often not doing much as a result in this scenario. They are just issuing the ASTs and taking the housing benefit sum. So whilst all the business management and maintenance is done by the care provider, a lot of care providers feel more comfortable that way, and it's understandable. Sometimes there can be problems with housing associations not doing quite what they're expected to do as quickly as they're expected to do it, maybe on the maintenance side. But therefore, your care provider, if you're going to have a situation like this, your care provider's got to be big enough really to have a real estate management function. And it can also be unhelpful if you're defending any suggestion around that regulatory point about whether there is a split between a real arm's length split between your provision of housing and your provision of care, then that's an unhelpful point, isn't it, if you're doing all of the property maintenance piece. The third model, which I must say is the one we're seeing most, or in the last few years, is the most common one that we've dealt with, or we've been asked to help with, and seems to be the way things work when we're talking about a nice purpose-built supported living setting and scheme. Is where the care provider does not have any interest in the property, but instead works with a developer and third-party landlord. That third-party developer landlord builds the scheme, grants a long-term lease to a RSL, a registered social landlord. The care provider provides the care to the people in the setting. The need then for the service level agreement is to agree what the split of responsibilities is between the landlord and the care provider. And a SLA, they're often referred to as nominations agreements or voids agreements, if you see reference to them. An SLA will generally cover sort of who is responsible for certain obligations around the property, housing related support obligations, who's going to help that vulnerable person with their housing benefit applications and things like that, who's going to manage fire safety at the property, Legionella, the other health and safety aspects, who's going to administer tenancies, etc. And then we'll come on to it a little bit of who can control who goes in and out of that property from a tenant who's granted occupation of those units, and is there a quid pro quo to that? Is there an agreement that if the care provider is dictating who goes in and out, or has control over who goes in and out, then do they then give some void coverage to give that RSL the sort of the comfort that they're going to be able to pay their rent to their ultimate landlord. The fourth one, which is missing off that list, I suppose, is someone genuinely in their own home, and that it does happen. Some people, working age adults, might have a house of their own, and might commission a provider such as Eden or others to provide support to them. We've left it off this only because we don't see it very often, to be honest, and most of the providers I've worked with over the years, you might have one or two settings like that, but generally it's not a common piece at the moment, or certainly not in our experience. Maybe unlike in the elderly settings, where that sort of home care, dom care support in that sort of way is a bit more prevalent. But I'll hand back to Mark there, who's going to talk about the SLAs and the risks he has to weigh up when looking at an opportunity. Mark, back to you.
Thanks, Dan. So considering the the trends that we've talked about in development, and where the market's kind of moving to. So again, whilst all SLAs are not going back to the constrictive sort of 25-year agreements, there has been an increase in length and the terms expected for both housing providers and care providers alike. Almost all SLAs will carry void liability to providers. There'll be various different ranges on that. Some could start from day one in a worst case scenario, and again, you'd want to watch out for that within an SLA. Primarily, the market is sitting at around 90 days, and then void liability will pass to providers. So you have 90 days to fill one of those voids. There's very little wiggle room available in the agreements should something happen, such as support for the service be pulled from a local authority, such as referrals are very slow at coming into the service. There's very little wiggle room, and again, that is something that would need to be addressed, and Dan will talk a little bit more around these elements and how to address them within an SLA at the front end. High levels of cost passed on from housing partners to care providers around specialist maintenance. Talked a little bit about how environments are changing for the better. They're becoming more robust. They're able to support a wider range of people. With that, there is things like specialist equipment now more prevalent in services, whether that's technology or equipment. And the maintenance of that can often be passed on to after the initial fit of the equipment, which is generally funded as part of someone's package. The maintenance of that can be passed on between housing providers to care providers, and they have to pick up the bill for that a little bit further down the line. And again, it's another point to watch out for and another point to consider when looking at your SLA. Rental increases, we've seen this more and more, that are set at a higher rate than CPI. Again, something that will be built into the SLA right from the front end, and definitely something that providers need to be aware of. Working with multiple local authorities can provide confusion. So again, there's various different expectations from local authorities around what a good SLA will look like. And again, they should be playing an active interest in the SLAs and the type of SLAs that providers are signing up to in schemes where they've given backing. Next one, please, Dan. Thank you. So risks to providers. So changes in the market are creating more risks within the SLA than ever before. Longer term commitments, higher voids, no guarantee of long term commitment. The key risk areas that we at Eden look at is lack of an exit. So there could be various reasons why a care provider would need to exercise an exit within an agreement, and Dan will touch a little bit on that. High onerous void terms for the provider, because again, that is putting financial stability and the sustainability of the service long term in jeopardy. Lack of uniformity from housing providers. Again, working with multiple housing providers across the country can cause confusion for providers, because you have multiple different approaches and multiple different terms held within an SLA, different terms, different expectations. Particularly if organisations have been established for 30 or 40 years, they'll have a whole raft of different SLA types and different SLA terms. And it can be quite confusing, and certainly something that needs a good watchful eye and good legal advice around. Lack of uniformity from local authorities, again, with elements like nomination rights, void coverage, and the active part that they would play in an SLA process. The 154 national local authorities, and everybody has a slightly different approach, so it can become quite confusing for providers. Lack of guarantees around continuous use of the service. So over the life of a development, or if we look at development from new development from its initial idea, its initial inception, to the point where that is built, handed over and able to occupy. That can be anywhere from 18 months to 2 years. It can be subject to delays, as all builds can as well. And that can change the perspective of local authorities. Their needs change, their approaches to commissioning change as well. So by the time a build is finished that's already under a signed SLA, there is no guarantee that that can continue on with good use by the local authority, with lots of referrals coming in, taking advantage of that service. So that is a risk that, again, is there for providers. And similarly, commissioning support being pulled for projects as they near completion. We do see that in the marketplace. I'm sure everybody has some level of experience around that as well, because their needs change, individuals within the local authority change as well. And by the time some of these projects are built, again, under an SLA, that support can be pulled. And then the provider's left with a huge risk of having to try and fill services against that SLA that they've signed up to. So I'm going to hand over to Dan, and Dan is going to talk to us a little bit more around what a good SLA will look like, considering all that we've talked about. Great,
thanks, Mark. So what does a good SLA look like? Well, this is mine and Mark's view, having acted having worked on a fair few over recent times, Mark and I, and then my view, having acted for a handful of providers over a long period of time and having negotiated them in-house for Craigmore and Priory. But I can't stress more enough, it's not a comprehensive list. Please don't take this bullet point list and sort of head off and negotiate them, because I think if there's one point I want to get across here, I think it's without trying to sound dramatic, these documents must be treated with real caution. They really do have the capacity to hurt your business or make it much more difficult to sell, and we've seen it happen. And it does sound dramatic, but we have genuinely seen it happen. Investors get very spooked about the risk of simply not getting on a framework when it comes around to renewal. So the idea, if you add in the risk that they could potentially not get on that framework, and actually there could be an obligation to pay rent payments on void units beyond that loss of framework, then they get really spooked, and we've seen them really tie themselves in knots. Ill-advised or uneducated potential purchasers, investors, really sort of find this point difficult, and so it's really important to, if you find yourself in a position where you're looking to sell, to have negotiated these agreements well, and to be able to present that information to potential purchasers in a way which is really sort of non-alarmist, shows a good track record of not paying any voids or very little voids, and also the approach, the risk-averse approach taken to negotiating the agreements. It's also worth saying, before I just get into this list, you can look to draft your own form of SLA or nominations agreement, and we have tried in the past. And you could put that to the RSL, but our experience has always been that the RSLs are very set on that they would want to use their own terms. They will present quite, not being casting aspersions at all, but they will present relatively onerous and one-sided drafts. They refresh them quite regularly, which means even if you've negotiated with them before, then you get, a year later, you get a different set of terms from them, which is back to being onerous and one-sided. And as Mark said, they can often be presented as sort of non-negotiable, but we've had real good success in testing them on that and getting them on a call, talking them through the real risks for the provider, the practical reality here, and how the document doesn't reflect that. So again, I would say if someone's presenting something to you and saying that's got to be signed as is, then it's still worth but checking care very carefully through it, working out what the risks are, and getting on a call, having that conversation with them and talking it through. We've had real good success in sort of challenging those sort of assertions from RSLs. So into the list. It's important for any contract, but term, break dates, termination, first one on the list. As Mark said, sort of 10, 15 years ago, we were looking at ones which were 25 years, and they were sort of, there was very little scope to try and get a decent break date in those. I say that there is, as a provider, there are pluses and minuses of longer terms. You are able to, you want a bit of time left on your SLAs, sort of to give you that comfort that you've got almost that, it's not security of tenure, but that sort of, ongoing trading at that property for a sensible period into the future. But equally, if you've got a 25-year term and you've got 2 years left on your framework, and potentially on the hook for void rental payments for 23 years or whatever, that's an extreme example, then that is, obviously that's a bit more difficult to stomach, and not a position you want to be in. We're generally, as Mark said, we're generally seeing RSLs offering terms of 10 to 15 years at the moment on new specifically developed supported living schemes, and it's usually possible to get a break date halfway through, 2/3 of the way through that term. That seems to be about normal. For context, the RSL are often signing up to a lease much longer than that, but they're able to sort of rationalise with their board that risk if they've got the half of the term sort of covered with a supported living, an SLA agreement with a support provider of repute. Termination, just make sure you are considering this carefully. It requires some careful thought, and it's quite bespoke, really, because some providers are different to others. When would you really want to be able to get out of the agreement? Often, usually we would have things like material breach of the terms, but there's also things, destruction of the building, etc. But also, what about if you fail to get on the local authority tender? We've always tried to shoehorn into SLAs that if the care provider is no longer providing care for an individual, then their obligations in relation to that unit cannot continue. Supported living, it came about really because it is an idea of choice, and the idea is, and theoretically it still could happen. I don't think it happens very often, but a service user can choose to be supported by another care provider, and so at that point, if you've got this SLA in place, it means that you have no capacity to enter that room, to enter that living unit, because you have no relationship with that service user anymore. Unless they invite you in, you cannot be responsible for checking the fire equipment, etc., within that room, dipping tanks for Legionella testing, etc. If you have no ability to enter that room or ask for it. So we've always sort of fought that cause. And then broader, if you come off the framework, can there be scope to terminate? Sometimes it's agreed by the RSL, sometimes it's not, but it's always a conversation worth having. Another point on termination is transfer of property. Would you want to be in the agreement with somebody else? There are some, I think we're past it now, but there has been some of the RSLs have had bad regulatory positions and things, and there are certain RSLs maybe that providers I've worked with who have not wanted to be in a contractual relationship with, and others which they would. So the idea that if the RSL sells a property, moves it on, they could put you into automatically put you into that agreement with somebody else has not been tenable to the providers I've worked with, and we've always wanted to have control over who that transfer might be to, and make sure it is an RSL who can access the higher rate housing benefit. That if they're going to be on lower, if it's not an RSL and they were only going to be receiving a lower rate of rent, then that might create problems in itself, in that they might then look to sort of do less of their obligations under the agreement. The second point on the list there is the exclusivity of nominations. This is a really fundamental point, because really, what the care provider wants here is a sort of control over and say in who is going into the scheme, who's granted occupation in the scheme. The landlord, you don't want a situation where the landlord fills a void with somebody, a person not in need of support, not part of the people who not being provided care to by you. There's all sorts of risks associated with that, compatibility assessments, etc., which might need to be carried out. And so the fundamental point here, and I can't stress enough that it is not in a lot of SLAs. I would say 9 times out of 10 we have to add this drafting into SLAs. It doesn't come across with it in. But you need a provision that no one can be granted occupation other than people that the care provider nominates. Equally, a linked point is veto rights. So the landlord might say, we have the ability to veto anyone we don't want to be nominated into the properties. And that's sort of fair enough, because if there was somebody with a history of arson, or for example, the landlord might fairly refuse to accept that person as a nomination. The point to be careful of here is if they were to refuse a nomination without good cause or without reference to a sensible set of reasons like history of arson, then your duty to pay the void liability shouldn't kick in if they've frustrated a placement. So i.e. you should be given a window of time to find another person if they've arbitrarily turned someone away. Because we shouldn't lose sight of the fact here that the housing association can often be in a better position financially, sitting on an empty property, receiving voids from a care provider, than actually having someone in occupation and having to deal with the property-related management and maintenance and capex that goes alongside that, particularly in these sort of settings. So number 3 is the quid pro quo for number 2. Really, if you want that exclusivity of nominations as a care provider, you have to make the commitment to the RSL to say we will cover the cost of empty units. If we can't keep the place full, then we'll cover the cost of empty units. And this is really fundamental when you're looking at these SLAs to make sure these provisions are correct. Sorry, excuse me. So the key points I always focus on here are: when does liability start and stop? If a RSL has evicted somebody, but not say they've terminated the tenancy agreement with a tenant, but they haven't actually managed to get them out yet, as a care provider, you're not in a position to go market that property. So my view is always that the tenancy agreement has to be terminated and the property has to be vacated before there's any suggestion that the care provider is on the hook to pay a void payment. Equally, at the other end, when somebody moves in, if somebody moves in but they haven't signed a tenancy agreement yet, then as care provider, your void liability should stop on the sooner of a tenancy agreement being signed or somebody moving in, because you haven't got the control to determine when a tenancy agreement happens. If somebody's moved in, say early, your obligation to pay voids shouldn't run until the later of those two. It should be the earlier of those two. Grace periods are pretty usual. There is often a period at the start, certainly with these new development sites, where we know that they're empty because you handed over the keys to a shiny new building. They're often, can be negotiated with the developer and the RSL a sort of 6 month, 3 to 6 months, I would say, probably more usual period to fill the service before the obligation to pay for voids starts. And then equally, when somebody moves out, often you can have a sort of 8 to 12 week period where the care provider is given a period of grace to find the next tenant before that void liability kicks in. And I think that's really useful. Again, it can mean the difference between sort of demonstrating having paid voids and maybe actually avoiding having paid any voids at the point if we're thinking about situations where maybe you want to sell your business and you're trying to demonstrate a good void payments track record. And lastly, how much is it? Again, you'd be amazed how many SLAs we get through and it doesn't make clear exactly what that void payment from the provider is. Is it, it is just the amount that the RSL decides to put in the service user's tenancy agreement, and there's no clarity on how much that is. And so we always try and make that really very, very clear. And then to the next point, the rent control point, again, really important point. High rents, and I've seen this happen, I'm afraid. One of the less scrupulous RSLs was putting rents up to a level which was prohibitive, and actually they were really the care provider was really struggling to find placements because the rent levels were too high. So we really focus on this in these SLAs. We want a cap on the service charge and rent combined that does not exceed the amount of housing benefit and other benefit payments that a person to be supported can receive. And usually that's agreeable. We've not really had any problems trying to agree that, but it means that the placement is always the vacancy is always going to be affordable for people that we can find with the local authority and the commissioner team. And equally, we find often that we'll try and put sensible caps in to say that they can't up it too much each year. They can't go above like a CPI increase each year, and they can't increase rents or service charges more than once a year. Just to try and keep some kind of objective control over that. I'm conscious of time, but I think the property maintenance one is an important one. My experience at the Priory was always that units needed quite a lot of capex and a lot of refurbishment when somebody moved out, and the Housing Association RSL should be the one doing that, and they should be incentivized to do that promptly. So again, the key here is that there's a contractual obligation for them to put that unit back to a habitable standard, clean and marketable standard, before any suggestion of any void payment from the support provider comes into play. And then the last few bits, I'll just touch on these last few. Watch out for something called an evergreen clause. Often there is, we're finding it increasingly in RSL SLAs now, a clause which says if the agreement is terminated, then the care provider will continue to care for the service users until new housing is found, and they will help us to find new housing solutions for them. Now that sounds relatively innocuous, but in reality the care provider might not be getting paid for anything to do with that at that stage. And in reality, I'm sure conscientious care providers will provide that support, but it's very different having a contractual obligation to do it. You need to be able to threaten and to be able to say, we're not getting paid to do this, there's no contractual obligation to do this. It's really important in that sort of situation that it is any assistance you provide is at your choice, not a contractual obligation. I'll pause there. So Richard, do you want to go to Q&A for the last 15 minutes?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, really, really helpful. Normally I spend a bit of time just feeding back, but we've got quite a lot of questions coming, so I do want to go to those. But just to summarise some of the points, you've talked about the increase in dependency, the fact that we've got 37,000 units more needed in the next couple of years, the void liabilities, CPI issues, the onerous terms, really putting the monkey on the back of the care providers. There's a lot of risk sitting on care providers' shoulders here that we need to be aware of. And we know that commissioners really want this type of accommodation because it generally is more affordable than longer term residential care. So there is a drive towards it, hence the growth. The lack of REAP funding is really interesting, you know, given what Welltower have done recently with some of the older person services. To see that not coming through for supported living is interesting. Very, very helpful oversight on the, you know, SLA and best practice, but really kind of driving home that providers can do a lot of this themselves, and if you've got internal teams that can do it, that's great. But I would suggest that there is definitely the need to get some support from council here from time to time to really look at some of those things that might be perceived as non-negotiable, which actually there is a potential to kind of manipulate those terms that local authorities aren't initially keen to negotiate on. Let's just go to some of the questions. There's quite a few come through, along with some comments. I'm going to try and keep up with everything because they're all flying through now. So Ben has asked, first of all, is there not a conflict of interest for being a care provider and owning a property? If we can keep them quite short as answers, that'd be great. We've got quite a few to get through. Probably over to yourself, Dan, on that one.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, fundamentally, it's not a correct compliant model. I have for years sort of told everybody that this is not compliant. There's very clear guidance about not doing that. The bit that cuts across my advice there is the fact that there's never been any enforcement that I've ever heard of. Really, there's been slaps across the wrist and a bit of steer. And I'm aware of a large provider that got a note from CQC to just say, look, we note that you own the properties on these and we didn't realise that, and you might want to look at rectifying that. But I'm not aware of any proper regulatory enforcement, so it is still prevalent.
Fantastic. And just made a couple of comments as well, saying that in a lot of service specifications with local authorities, you have to have the property very separate from the housing provider, as you've kind of just talked to. Providers are struggling to get good specialist landlords, and a lot of local authorities are not interested on anyone that has a poor rating. The regulator and some landlords will only support specific groups, which makes it more challenging when filling voids. Either of you have any comments on those points Angela's made?
I would just like to say that I think it can be difficult, it can be tricky. There's some really good housing providers out there. I think building those relationships and doing that due diligence piece around housing providers before you enter into relationships, and leaning on other providers as well for their experience and introductions and things of that nature, where we know there are good ones, can definitely help.
Brilliant, thank you. James has also made a comment. You know, it would be difficult to meet real tenancy rules if both the care provider and landlord, without an RP in the middle, appreciate some choose to operate in this way, also cannot achieve exempt rent if not RP. Any comments on that point there, Dan or Mark?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And thankfully there is a financial incentive. Well, that ability to access the higher rate housing benefit is a great reason to work with an RSL. My understanding has always been that there's not really any money, and that's why it is you know, housing associations that do this, because really there's no money to be made in that landlord function side of things when looking at this type of accommodation. But yeah, they're not concerned with that as such. They're just concerned with not losing it.
Brilliant.
And developers, in terms of the type of properties that we have talked about today, in terms of those new developments, will insist on a housing provider involvement.
Brilliant. Something just Mary's put in there. She's mentioned a comment around the sort of the baby boomers, and we're seeing a shift from those that maybe would have been in residential accommodation moving into sort of more supported living, probably is a lower cost to many of the care providers. But Mary asks if there's any impact on the Renters' Rights Bill here.
I suppose the effect for care providers to be wary of would be that it's going to make evictions harder. That my understanding of the Renters' Rights Bill, not being a property lawyer, is that it is going to provide extra rights, and it will make it harder to evict people.
And Gurpreet and Emma have had a bit of a conversation. I haven't kept up with all of it, but Gurpreet sort of asked around if you can say a little bit more about the CQC refusing to register larger services, and Emma's pointed out around the kind of right care, right culture, right place, you know, and the push for improvements for service users with learning disabilities and autism. Is there anything you can add to that conversation?
Yeah, so that was based on the 2019 ruling in which CQC ruled against Lifeways and refused their application to refuse an application to vary their registration to add an additional site that they felt had an institutional appearance, and that was based upon its size, based upon its scale on the site. And that's where the campus feel kind of terminology came from, and it was a focus for CQC that it definitely wasn't meeting the right cultural environment and had that institutional feel because of its size. So it is something for developers to watch out for. It's something for housing providers and care providers alike to watch out for when looking at these schemes. Is it likely to have a pushback from CQC?
Fantastic.
And it's a strange one, that one, because it's technically CQC haven't got jurisdiction. We're talking about people in their own homes here, and CQC inspect the care agency, central office. But we've heard reports of CQC being quite active in lobbying local authorities and actually preventing local authorities commissioning larger services, only in pockets of the country, but it's definitely happening.
Yeah, we've seen it. We've raised it many times with the CQC, but it doesn't seem to be anything they're ready to sort of change at the moment. James has said that we've seen increasing poor behaviour from landlords, slow or incomplete repairs, withholding rent, slow payment, not completing regular checks, etc. What are the options for escalating that beyond raising with the senior management? And should this be defined in the service level agreement?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go on, Mark.
I was just going to jump in the first bit, Dan, and then tee you up really. But in terms of what the care provider can be doing inside, internally, I would be seeking legal advice if that is an ongoing, consistent problem, because the chances are they're breaking elements of the SLA agreement that they have in place with you and or the tenancy that they have with the individual. So there should be a level of scrutiny that's held to that, and there should be a level of legal advice that organisations are taking.
Yeah, we try in our SLAs to make sure that it's really prescriptive about the standard of housing, so it can be reasonably clear about if they've not done something or if an aspect of a property is not up to standard. That's reasonably black and white. And then what we would often have is if the landlord doesn't do what they're supposed to do, the care provider can, if it chooses to, take that action, rectify that problem, and then recharge the landlord. There's a cost benefit analysis to do, isn't there? If it used to, you spend the money so that you can move on, get somebody in, but then you are waiting to be paid back by the housing association. But I suppose there is scope to, if you had a void payment in the future, you would just offset it, wouldn't you, and look to do it that way.
Brilliant. Now we're going to, about 5 minutes left. We've got quite a few questions, so some sort of rapid fire ones, if that's okay. Julie's asked, can an RSL novate the SLA to another company without the care provider's agreement?
It depends entirely on the terms. In our ones, we say no. It has to be with our consent, and it has to be to an RSL.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Simon says RSH seems to be discouraging RPs from taking on leases for more than 10 years. Is this having an impact on investor appetite and supply? Good question. Mark?
It absolutely will. I personally haven't seen many examples of that. However, the situation you're describing there absolutely would have a self-funding developer. His appetite would definitely be reduced by that in terms of their return on investment and how long a period they would need that security for.
Super, thank you. That's interesting. Michael also says here, if a new care provider is put in place, is there an argument that the agreement has been frustrated as the old care provider is unable to service the agreement? Would this be a potential way to exit the service level agreement?
Yeah, there is. You could potentially put together an argument around that. My experience of that situation is actually that it's in everyone's interest to be quite sensible. You don't want to be in the position where you are sort of still on the hook whilst a new situation is rectified. But we've had a few over the years where a new provider has agreed to step into the shoes of the old provider in an SLA to be able to use that property, and everyone's reasonably sensible depending on the parties. But yeah, it's not necessarily that you're going to sit there and play out the rest of your term without being on the framework.
Okay, just 3 more questions if that's okay. Mark, did you want to say something there? Sorry.
Only that propcos are commonplace, particularly with smaller providers, and the lack of REIT funding is going to draw providers to start to produce their own under a propco. So going forward, large, small, medium providers will start to produce their own property.
And are both registered with the CQC, OpCo and PropCo?
No, there wouldn't be any regulated activity. Well, the argument would be there'd be no regulated activity being provided by the PropCo.
Brilliant. Ben says, apart from Civitas and Triple Point, is there anywhere else to find property with an RP in situ?
So we work with a multitude of self-developers, have good relationships with developers right across the country, and those relationships are built and maintained over time. So yes, there are multiple opportunities to do that with RPs in situ.
Fantastic.
And I guess there's, there are, sometimes there are care providers who maybe just haven't made a scheme work, who are looking to exercise their break clauses, and then the RP is then looking to install somebody new. So then there's a ready-made service for somebody if you could be in the right place at the right time.
Fantastic. Just 2 more questions. The new Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Act. In that act, it states that all services have to be licensed. Does the panel know who the license will sit with, the landlord or the local authority?
Pass. No, I'm not going to blag it. I know. I don't know that at this stage, but I'll take that one away. Maybe try and follow up afterwards. That's
wonderful. And the very last question from Russell, you mentioned that there was difficulty improving the regulatory compliance if the provider keeps maintenance in-house despite the use of an RSL. We have started to enter non-repairing leases with RSLs due to poor responses on maintenance SLAs. Do you see this as a real issue?
I can't conscionably sit here and say it's a real issue because of the lack of enforcement action. Theoretically, it would be unhelpful, wouldn't it, if you were trying to defend yourself to show that you're doing all the property maintenance piece, and you are the ultimate freehold owner. But equally, I don't think it is a real risk, being honest at the moment.
Yeah, and
don't quote me on that though.
the advantage of that, of course, working in a provider, that you get that level of control back. So in that scenario, you are able to put the people supported, the tenants' needs at the forefront of that. So as Dan says, there's very little in case that would probably stack against that, but the benefits are probably going to be there.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to draw things to a close because we have just hit time. But what I'm seeing from this is actually I think we need to do a bit more work. I think we need to kind of get some of this written up and really help providers to understand these issues in a bit more detail, because there's clearly a lot to kind of break down here, far more than I thought we would kind of cover off today. So huge thank you to yourself, Ben and Mark, for being so open and sharing all of your experience with us, because it's incredibly important that we see this area of growth and as an area of growth, and that we're able to support providers who want to continue to develop and invest in social care to be able to do so, and to make sure they are de-risking and not carrying too much weight on their shoulders, because margins are tight. So we will do some more work on this. We'll figure out what that looks like. But please, those of you who joined the call, do let us know if you think there's anything else that you think specifically you'd like us to cover, and we'll get Mark and Dan potentially back around the table to kind of talk in a bit more detail. Huge thank you to everyone joined today. We will get a copy of the recording out. At one point that Dan was unable to respond to, we'll try and get a response in the next 48 hours to you, just with a position on that one. But yeah, please do stay in contact. Let us know any issues, any concerns, any problems. Drop us an email at Care England, info@careengland.org.uk, and we will pull together another event for you. Huge thank you to Dan and Mark, and we look forward to working with you all again very soon.